Yeah, I was keen to talk to you again, really about a lot of things well, some of the things we mentioned last week, because I literally woke up the next day with a hangover, which was in part produced by cheap Asian beer, but it was also genuinely the product of sheer despair, which I think we spent a good time spinning out. I think what I was struck by in a conversation was the your doubt as to the possibility of a crash and recovery scenario. For me, that's something I held out. I think both of us have some idea of decline, which I probably think would be useful for us to actually really spell out what we mean by that. Just knock the idea back and forth. But for me, I had the idea with that there could be some form of recovery as sort of things play out, as this decline reaches a conclusion, reach some sort of crash, a reset and recovery. Whereas if memory serves me correctly, you were much more pessimistic on that point, thinking that this census decline is terminal, particularly for your own country, which I always held out the possibility of some sort of recovery. But we can start this from any direction you like.
Well, yeah, I'd be happy to clarify kind of what I meant and what I guess my view is.
Well, I suppose, decline is the first thing to actually point out, I suppose useful for us to remember, is that decline is very much, even before it's defined, it's very much a minority view. I would say I doubt really a majority of any electorate in any, say, Western country, we'll just keep our views to that for now. I doubt a majority would hold to a sense that their country is in decline. There would be the belief that there are problems, but problems which still largely they believe are conventionally resolvable.
Well, it's hard to say if you're talking strictly about perceptions of U.S. citizens inside the U.S. about whether they are in decline. You'll have a kind of cognitive dissonance, I think. You'll have people who, if they feel that they have to give any kind of public patriotic answer, will say, no, no, we're the greatest country in the world, that kind of nonsense. But when you listen to their assessments of history and so on, sort of when they're talking unthinkingly, what you'll hear all the time is precisely that the country's in decline. In the U.S., they refer to the people who fought in the Second World War as the greatest generation.
Okay.
And they do so partly because I think in the back of people's minds, they view that period of time, the end of the Second World War in the 1950s, as the high point. I mean, even on some comedy shows, you can see Jon Stewart on The Daily Show at one point refer to that era as the high point, and everything since then being kind of long decline. Now, that doesn't mean that they think the end is near. So, in a way, I think most people in the U.S. will think of it being a long, perpetual decline. And that's just the U.S. In terms of what I was getting at last time, I mean, if life continues to exist, there's a chance for rebirth. So if life continues, things will renew themselves. I don't have any doubt about that. But really, what's at stake is whether or not anything recognizable to us will renew itself or reappear. I mean, if you look at the disappearance of classical antiquity in Europe, the Greeks and the Romans, all of that, that became buried and kind of forgotten in its, I think, in its most essential form for a long time. What survived now were mutations that today, people who think they have an idea of what Western civilization is, or Western culture, quote unquote, they would look at things from the period between 500 AD and 1000 AD as being alien or foreign. So if people in Rome, the Roman Empire, were hoping that something would live on and survive, well, something did, but nothing that they could remotely take heart in as being part of them, their way of life. So, in terms of the U.S. and the broader civilization we're in, if the species doesn't go extinct and is able to flourish um, based on more fundamental reasons, we don't exist in a severely depopulated world with lots of perpetual health crises and, I don't know, atomic fallout. Putting those scenarios aside, if biological life is able to thrive, then human beings will renew themselves. But at what point? It could be ages from now, and it'll be an entirely different form that we don't recognize.
Right. Well, I think that I'd be interested really to hear your view on what exactly you consider. I mean, if objectively you were to try and trace this, the arc of current Western countries of Western civilization, that would you hone in on its material aspects and look at overall standards of living, employment numbers, productivity, and then would you tie that in against environmental numbers to see how maybe this is a self-defeating process? Or would your focus be more on what is happening culturally? I mean, in terms of an intellectual culture, as far as you can identify it, and I mean, naturally, that's tied to an economic and an environmental condition. But is is it possible, let's say, that the Disclosure Project, for instance, somehow wins the day, and it appeals to the better angels on the what Stephen Greer now calls SIG, the Senior Interagency Group, which is now the current Majestic organization, apparently. So they see good sense, or a majority of them see good sense, and they release into the world these over unity energy devices, not least. And this puts our economic production on a much more secure footing. Because we've now done for, assuming we've done for then the global warming and the climate crisis, done for global warming, and hence put an end to the climate crisis. Even if that were the case, then would you still think there is some sort of ongoing cultural decline independent of that?
Well, there are scenarios in which the decline doesn't continue because it's arrested. I mean, if you're going to talk about the release of free energy technology into the broader civilization, that totally changes everything. And there are other situations you can imagine. If you have some sort, if you're going to go to that length to imagine a scenario in which some freak event, for example, the free energy release or maybe overt alien contact or who knows what. I mean, if something like that were to unleash a widespread feeling of emancipation and freedom, then it's a total different story. I think if free energy technology suddenly became instantly available to everybody without condition, then the feeling of emancipation that would spread underneath throughout the populations and civilizations would result in a decisive change. But you see, there's a difference between theoretical possibility of some outside event happening and extrapolating from current trends. So everything taken as they are now, the same wheels set in motion, if they continue, then I think there's a certain set of outcomes. I mean, if you're in a car racing toward the edge of a cliff, all things being equal, the car will go off the cliff. However, you might well be struck by a meteor before you reach the cliff, averting the outcome. So,
Yeah, well, I suppose why I ask is I'm trying to gain some sense of what may be the, blocking factors to something like a disclosure project having more broader success. Is it, crudely, that there is some sort of devolution in train that needs to play out, and that in widespread introduction of some sort of over unity system, or at least considerable gains in energy generation efficiencies, is would not in that condition would not be at all a positive development.
Well, if I understand you correctly, the answer I would give would be similar to the last one. I mean, if the character of everyday human experience changed for most people in a positive direction in a short period of time for some reason, then I think the particular type of decline that we're in now could well be transformed into something different, a movement in a different direction. Um, I think that people on a less than conscious level all desire this sort of thing. You know, when you're a very small child, a toddler, for example, from that point on, when a toddler is able to walk, and the more that they're able to do, there's a feeling of jubilation, and there's a feeling of ongoing jubilation as they increase in their mastery. So when you're able to draw pictures, you're able to, go to the bathroom by yourself, you're able to do this, that, and the other thing. Um, I think that's fairly universal as far as you can say anything's universal about human beings. There is built into the biology of the human body a feeling of jubilation and desire to increase one's ability and power. Now, if you introduce these really exotic events like the introduction of free energy into a civilization, and everyone feels that way, then the social and cultural forces that are leading to a decline would be knocked in a different direction. The internet in the beginning was something similar like that. I mean, the fact that you could all of a sudden communicate with all these people around the world and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's, in technology, we find in fits and starts these increases in the positive feeling of emancipation from limitation. So if you're talking about over unity, free energy, and that sort of thing, naturally it all depends on what kind of technology it is, how it's released, how long it takes for people to get their hands on it, whether they
Right,
get their hands on it,
right.
all that sort of thing.
Well, where I'm just imagining this scenario is simply for the average end user that the costs of energy become, obviously much lower, but there's still a grid, there's still a functioning grid. Most people don't have their hands on the technology. It's, run through your various utilities. And in terms of how it impacts on life, whether people have a sense of emancipation, I really don't know. Um, you can look at any numbers of countries which have gone through rapid economic development, and their societies, the members of their societies, have become emancipated in very real material ways. Does that give rise to a euphoria or a changed mood? I mean, are Singaporeans or South Koreans happier now than they were 30 years ago? Does their culture look that much different? I'm not sure. Um, what what I'm trying to really get at is that when we're looking at it at a decline, and assuming it's to do fundamentally in our just capacity to really think and feel as an aggregate, if that in itself is undergoing some sort of secular decline, which is really independent maybe of the material conditions, which themselves are obviously degrading. With that consideration, trying to really work out is something like the Disclosure Project even worthwhile? You know, if it can secure that release of that technology, would it really fundamentally make a difference? My concerns here are, obviously ill-defined, but it's something, this question of social context and the question of social dynamics underpinning ufology is something which is largely ignored. It doesn't quite come up. Um, and that's really what, for me, is kind of a purpose in our conversation here, is to maybe look at that.
Well, when you say the Disclosure Project, what I tend to do is immediately start to um, see it from as many angles as possible. I mean, you have figures like Greer and Bassett and some diehard members, recognizable figures in the UFO world, who probably alone make up the Disclosure Project proper. If we're talking about Disclosure Project, we have these figures. Now, there are likely many people of an unknown number, but many people who don't necessarily identify with the Disclosure Project or participate in its activities in any active way, but who nevertheless might really passionately feel that disclosure is something that should occur. So you might refer to these people, perhaps including the core group, as a disclosure movement or disclosure interest. Now, I think that there is a use and an inevitable consequence to having a disclosure movement or interest. So to that extent, the fact that Greer and Bassett and these guys exist at all is a benefit, because they at least stand simply as a kind of cipher for an interest in official recognition of the reality of various phenomena. Now, I think we were discussing last time that, from the inside of the UFO world, you can have some pretty strong reservations about people like Greer and so on. But that, in a way, is a separate issue from their effect on the broader culture or on a given political situation at a particular moment. Now, I personally have seen no evidence that the Disclosure Project has resulted in any political change, even potential political change, although that is open to debate. I mean, you do have people like John Podesta, who is a government official, advisor to different White Houses, will probably be running the Hillary Clinton election campaign, who is big on UFOs and disclosure. But this may well be an entirely individual interest of his, or perhaps at some point he was influenced by the Disclosure Project, and we have them to thank. I don't know. That's a biographical or historical question. But when it comes to concrete policy decisions or any kind of actual movement in the direction of disclosure among political figures, I see no evidence that the Disclosure Project has achieved that. They have achieved very slight gains in the media culture, which means the culture at large. The year 2000 event or 2001, where they met in Washington D.C. and had all of the uniformed personnel, that I think had some impact, even if it's negligible in concrete terms. The fact that there were people sitting there and media figures who knew, observed this going on. I mean, there must have been some effect. Likewise, the citizens' hearing not long ago, where they brought in retired congressmen and women, and they did a couple of days. So, I mean, these have some effect, although it's hard to measure, I'm sure, on the culture at large. So you have that. But how you get from a disclosure project or even a disclosure movement to the actual seismic shift in deep government policy circles where classified technology comes out in any form, I don't know. I don't see a way to get from one to the other.
Well, I mean, Greer does report on that relationship between his movement and the deep state, to use the good term, is that his movement was very much facilitated from elements there. His estimate was currently a third of this controlling group wished for disclosure of some kind. No, I correct myself. It had been a third in the early days of his movement, and that later rose to be said in near plurality. But obviously, there's no movement there. What I find, strange with the Disclosure Project is that it sort of seemed to have completely run out of steam, even as a public organization. There's this, huge press conference first in so many ways. And, they marshaled an impressive body of evidence. And it comes to seemingly nothing, even publicly, it didn't give rise to a clamoring for disclosure. And, even more broadly, it still remains largely unknown. Now, why that would be is, again, this sort of, we arrived then at this question of cultural decline, because on its face, the Disclosure Project did marshal an impressive amount of evidence. There's just too many first-hand witnesses. I think at last count of 400 to 500 who have insider knowledge. And this in itself, you would think that the cumulative weight of evidence would just force the culture at large to begin, to acknowledge this subject. But that hasn't happened. I think that's fair to say. I don't think there's really it's made an impact on society at large, and nor do I think it will have an impact in the future. It's not as if the Disclosure Project can be sort of repackaged and relaunched at a later point, at some foreseeable point in the near future, with having a different set of broader outcomes. There is this issue of cultural response, which to me, to be honest, is quite mysterious. But I think it's reasonable to say that response isn't set to change anytime soon.
Well, I see it the same way you do. I don't think that there's going to be any kind of disclosure or cultural clamor for disclosure, but it would be, again, for historical reasons. If you refer back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago with the what I call a feeling of emancipation, you could equally use other terms to describe the same sort of thing. You could talk about cultural dynamism or momentum. When you look at the Chinese today and the sheer fact that they can riot over public officials' corruption, that's significant. I think it's simply put down to the fact that there is a Chinese middle class now, and because of the sheer rapid change and improvement on average in everyone's lives, they identify with this feeling of increasing power and increasing liberation from limitation and past deprivation and so on. So they feel more powerful, therefore they're more quick to assert themselves. That's one part of it. Another part of it is in a lot of these countries, particularly countries where the nation state is evident in the classic sense, where you have a single tribe that more or less is the country. There is a kind of collective mind that is reflexive in the sense that an individual mind is. And this involves the media as well. So culture at large in these countries is considered the kind of universal domain. And it's no coincidence that in these countries there are still considered to exist universal codes of conduct and so on. So what I'm getting at is that there is this sphere, this locus, the public sphere, the public cultural space, is still connected with the concept of the universal in a lot of these places. And as a result, when everybody thinks the same way about something, what happens is, in environments of dynamism and momentum, thinking one thing produces an outcome in terms of action. So if some public official is disgraced and shown to be an out-and-out rogue, everybody thinks the same thing at the same time, and they all know that they're thinking the same thing at the same time, so that has a one-to-one correspondence with the resulting action. So like the group takes action. They all think the same thought, and then they all undertake the same action. Now, I'm explaining it in a somewhat indirect way, but what I just said about the group thinking together and then acting together in this scenario I'm describing involves two conditions. One, sufficient dynamism or cultural momentum that, at least in recent times, is basically economic. We all know that every country in the world has an oppressive top-down government. In fact, that is what the human state is. It's a way for the few to harvest the wealth of the many. Really, I think that's all it's ever been. But there's always a kind of negotiation between the state and the population. And when you have an economic explosion that sufficiently empowers the population at large, it gets given the term middle class. And so you have this feeling of power. So that's the one condition. The other condition is that culture itself not be fragmented in such a way that it's impossible for a group feeling to translate into a group action. Now, in the US today, for reasons we've discussed previously, the cultural sphere no longer has any connection with the universal. Instead, what you have is this pluralism. That's the ideal that they ascribe to it. But I really rather think that the ideal itself of pluralism is kind of like a rationalization after the fact. I mean, you had this nation state in the US, let's say between 1900 and 1950, that was basically white, quote unquote. And so it was a nation in the classic sense where you had the tribe, the blood of the tribe, combined with the territory equaling the nation. In an effort to correct injustices to other races that were already in this quote unquote nation for hundreds of years, the relationship between the public cultural sphere and the universal began to fracture. And then when you had the Vietnam War and you had a whole generation of young people rejecting traditional society because the traditional society was saying go die in this war that's irrelevant and unnecessary, you had the creation of what they call counterculture. Since that time, in my opinion, it's fragmented more and more and more to the point where now, facilitated by the internet, everything is particular and there is no universal. I mean, every website, every web forum, everyone's got their own little crazy little niche, their own group. So there is a long answer to your question. Why doesn't abundant proof of, an alien presence or whatever you want to call it translate into collective action today? Well, it's because there's no collective action about anything
Right.
in a certain sense.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I framed it a little differently in thinking about in your country's instance, that the American social self has largely evaporated, and that's indicated by, I suppose, the death of really class-based politics, um, where there is that sense that you are existing, not least individually and personally, privately, but you have a social and public existence, which is objectively shared by many others, and by transforming that sort of objective condition, you can improve the condition of the self. And I think that sense is, well, I think that's how I interpret what you're saying, is that that's largely gone, that the American individual is become privatized, to be crude, but is leading an intensely or hyper individualistic and um, life fragmented into any number of subcultures based upon any number of really self-selected identities. So whether it's, you know, I suppose the obvious ones of supposed ethnic identity and sexuality, religious groups, um, and then you can see it amongst youth culture, the pluralism there. I mean, the sheer various numbers of youth groups. So cumulatively, then what you're looking at is a mass of people who really can't see how it see where disclosure fits inside their existence. If they don't actually think of themselves as having a social existence, I suppose with a capital S, then the meaning of or the impact of disclosure on society or on the country at large is just entirely lost on them. I mean, it, I would take that point, but what I would still come back to is that even if you have in the US, you've this series of fragmented groups and what have you, they're still based in an objective physical reality. Um, and if you have, further increase in unemployment or, further demonstration of police brutality, finally people you would have to assume that the cognitive dissonance gives way to a renewed recognition of their social existence. Um, and I suppose, I mean, it's, looking at it that way, you'd think it's really that for something like the Disclosure Project or even ufology as a whole, it's only the only hope that becomes more meaningful to society and to culture at large is if society and culture at large reappears in the minds of the populace, which have sort of given it up for various, the ephemera they find in various forms of identity politics and what forms of expression life technology can offer. Um, but it's at the same time though, when we look at that, you have to think that in a way it's almost a trivial sort of series of trivial points as opposed to the actions of the deep state and what's actually known within U.S. government and various elements of the secret government. Um, that I mean, their control of and management of the subject, you have to assume is near perfect, assuming there's no breaking it from outside. And I just, I think we touched on a lot. We did speak about it last week, but you have to wonder is how that deep state views that fragmentation in society at large. Is, would there be any determination there to, reconfigure the U.S. or reshape the U.S. or are they basically just entrapped by a series of very limited bureaucratic perspectives?
Well, if you want to speculate about the deep state in those terms, I would say that there are two things going on. One that we have to bear in mind is that, and this is in a way the one I regard as more important, that members of the so-called deep state, and if you want to refer to it differently, if we want to talk specifically about a UFO cover-up, we said the people who maintain the UFO cover-up, they are drawn in from the culture at large in whatever country where this applies. I mean, it's something to suppose that back in the 50s there were these academics and scientists and so on. Many of them were probably born at the end of the 1800s who, you know, now overawed by the prospect of the atomic age and so on, and started this cover up and so on. But I mean, where has the fresh blood come from? Um, they, these any kind of maintained kernel of conspiracy like that over such a period of decades, multi-generational, has got to bring in people from the culture at large, and so those people are a byproduct of that culture at large, which brings me to the second point. I think also that there are probably sciences and techniques of social control and social understanding that have been developed and perspectives that have been devised by CIA and others over the generations that if we ever look back on it someday, if we ever find out or discover anything about them, we'll say, well, that's extraordinary that they developed not only a body of techniques that were effective, but that what was engendered was a viewpoint that in many ways was alien to the culture at large. And I think between the two, you're going to have some sort of parameters for the psychology of the people who are involved in this decision making that you're concerned with, the decision to release technology or to perpetuate a cover up. The culture at large is tending more and more toward sociopathy. You see it in law enforcement, you see it in school children. Everyone's becoming a sort of hyper-virtual, animalistic, amoral person. Individually, that's the tendency. And on the other hand, you have the separate historical tendency of these groups with their more effective than we can imagine techniques and their alien perspective. And the sociopaths, people without any kind of moral principle or feeling for the sacred, even if they're just dumb schmucks pulled in off the street, media kids, and run through that system and enculturated. They're people who come from the culture at large without any kind of deep humanity or principle, and then they are in this slightly alien world of the cover-up that perpetuates itself. Now, if that's true, if that's so, then how do you see in that um, the decision to release technology? You see, so that's the difficulty I have in imagining it happening.
Well, I mean, even sociologically, I think it's fair to say that the US military and the CIA are unrepresentative of the American at large. By my understanding, still large numbers, disproportionately large numbers of the officer corps of the military, of the recruits to the CIA are drawn from, as you said, the traditional American nation. So I would actually expect there, and by the fact that many of them are actually drawn into sort of state service, there is still sort of some residual concern for the greater good that is typical of tribal patriotism you'd find it in Europe. So I would expect that this cover up is led by men in their, we'll say men in their 60s. That many of them by that measure would be born in the 1950s and come of age in the 70s. Okay, sure, there was a counterculture that emerged in resistance to Vietnam in the late 60s and 70s, but equally there were still exponents of the culture. There were people who were opposed to going to Vietnam, but there's still many people who were in favor, who went to Vietnam and believed they did their duty. And I'd have to think that that's, if there's a cover up that's dominated by those elements, just guessing from the profiles of the US military. Along that, I'd add is just speculation or revelation, if you like, from, again, Greer. He talks about, well, who are these people in the cover up? By his account, the cover up now is the governing mechanism is transnational. He points to, without naming him, it's the Prince Regent of Liechtenstein as the head of this organization. I think essentially what happened was, through the vast private wealth, undisclosed wealth of various European families, it seemed that they were able to buy themselves in. As a result, he's ended up in charge. From the American side of things, Greer points to the enormous power of Catholic and Mormon elements inside this part of, as part of the UFO cover-up. And he does state, he says repeatedly, these men they have eschatological viewpoints. They actually believe that they are not only involved in the UFO cover-up, but they are readying for the world to come. And what Greer says there is ultimately, it would explain the nature of the cover-up. But I just find it hard to believe that such religious motivated people will have such control. And just in terms of how I actually see it working out, I could imagine it's your scientists, or at least military people with scientific background, who would take control, who would end up running this, because they simply understand what's happening. It's just the management has to understand what it's managing. And in time, I would just expect the managers of that cover-up are of really just academic, scientific backgrounds. Now, of course, that does not preclude religious fanaticism, but generally the two don't run together. So really, that's was a roundabout way of me saying is that I'm quite confused as to even the profile and nature of the cover-up.
Well, there's a lot that you just said that bears a response. As regards the U.S. military, you can look at it from a different set of facts, and setting aside sort of the more, I would say, charitable view that you've expressed, I would point to descriptions of experiences of people in the Vietnam War as a starting point. I mean, for a historical discussion of how the military has evolved and what situation it's in right now. I mean, there was an article I read not long ago by someone who had been in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and he said that everything that you hear today about Vietnam and so on is all bullshit, and that if you were a Marine in the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, your enemy was the Marine Corps, and that given the casualty rates, given the fact that you were there with no equipment for ages on end, um, this was a widespread feeling, was a reality. Moreover, we know for a fact that many officers, I guess you'd say, were killed by their own men in Vietnam. So there was a constant turnover rate. I'm not sure of the rank, but the sergeant or whoever comes, the platoon leader, whoever he is, he comes in and he's shot in the back of the head. They say the Viet Cong did it, they bring in another one. So this was routine. At the same time, because Vietnam was such a politically originated war. I mean, this was not Vietnam invading American territory, and this was not even the U.S. invading a territory occupied by the Soviets. This was some total bullshit. The only people who could rise up through the ranks of the U.S. military, thanks to Vietnam War, were politically savvy bullshitters. And if you read a variety of sources, people who were in the armed forces and who criticize it today, they say, well, if you look at the Pentagon, you're not dealing with people who are clear-headed pragmatists who simply want to serve their country. That's an outdated notion. The fact that each of these wars gets, approved by the military, basically, and get with willing participation again and again and again, is because of the fact that people who get to the highest levels of power in the U.S. military are willing to drink the Kool-Aid without fail all the time. So we have that. We have that developing. Now, in a, sort of reciprocal motion, if you look at the lowest levels today of the military, the enlisted personnel, I mean, you look at things like the Abu Ghraib situation, where they're running a prison and they're bringing out prisoners and torturing them and photographing it and having a great time, electrocuting their genitals, rape, all that kind of stuff. Who was doing that? Well, in this case, it wasn't the officers. It was the everyday idiots they pulled in off the street who were part of the military. We see the same thing at Guantanamo. How can you be in the army or whatever the branches that runs Guantanamo and be able to sleep at night or have a clear conscience? You've got people who are tied up with plastic ties for 23 hours a day. I mean, they're basically tortured. Solitary confinement, bags over their head. Many of them come in, there have been many cases where they're brought in as teenagers. And many more of them obviously have no link to terrorism at all. So this goes on and on and on. The military in the U.S. that we see at all from the public perspective is hopelessly corrupt. That's not even to mention the fact, though I'll mention it briefly, that there is no military per se anymore that you can draw a circle around. On the one hand, combat functions and support functions have been significantly privatized. So you have these mercenary groups like what used to be called Blackwater. Now they've changed their name 3 times, who have even less principle. I mean, basically they have less restraint, let's put it that way. So at the level of military operations and military undertaking, it's not even just military anymore. Then, on the other hand, you also have this huge revolving door, collective revolving door between the Pentagon and all of these defense contractors and suppliers and think tanks and businesses. So it's a massive mini civilization that's basically economic in its orientation. So looking at those aspects, I find it hard to imagine that anybody who, out of a kind of naive sense of duty, would be even there to be in a position to have any control. So that's the first thing to what you said. The second thing regarding Greer is I would really caution against taking almost any particular that he says as having any value. Now, I think that events where he describes meetings with certain officials probably have happened. And I think that his public undertakings as far as disclosure go have probably had benefit. But I think he is a person who psychologically he is very highly prone to self-aggrandisement. And I think a lot of these statements he comes out with, like where he says he knows for a fact that there are 86 separate alien races visiting the planet, or this sort of thing. The fact that these statements are made and they're almost certainly bullshit, it really makes you have to, temper what he says when it comes to, what percentage of the deep state is currently in favor of disclosure, what percentage isn't. Well, how on earth would he be in a position to know? People in the deep state aren't even in a position to know, I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
The third and final thing, I
Sure.
have to, I apologize for talking long, but I have to say it. And that is that when it comes to a question of who is in control of the cover-up, I think at this point, it's no longer possible to really suppose that there's a group of, let's say, academics who are in charge. Ultimately, I mean, there are people, there's evidence to suppose, there are people who work with that alien technology, who work in secret facilities, who are exposed to all sorts of little pieces of the puzzle, but they're not in control of the cover-up. While they may participate in what is being covered up, they're not in control of it. When you ask the question, who is in control of the cover-up, in the end, the only people in charge of the cover-up are those to whom techniques of compartmentalization are known. The people who organize it, who create the framework, and who say that this goes to this base and this goes to that base, and these people in these labs will never talk about each other. The people who manage the actual framework of secrecy, because when you work in these places, even labs where you require a government clearance, they're not working on alien technology. Like, let's say a nuclear facility or something like that. Any place where there's classified research going on, like a Sandia or some of the others, there are people who are compartmentalized and they don't talk to each other, even in the cafeteria, other scientists who are not given clearance to know anything about the project. So who makes the decisions about how the compartmentalization works? Those are the people ultimately in charge of the cover-up. And you know what? Those people at this late date may only have a limited idea of what the hell they're covering up. They may simply know that it has to be compartmentalized. There could very well be no one in charge at this point. And then the question is endlessly more complicated if you imagine that extraterrestrials have taken advantage of this fact. You've got stories of people spotting a gray in the Pentagon and that sort of thing. Now, I've always said that the fatal flaw of institutional secrecy is that if you have only 4, 5, 6 people in charge of secrecy, then you only need to control 4, 5, or 6 people if you're the aliens to completely control the whole issue the way it's handled on the planet Earth. And it's the same principle. Whoever is in charge of the compartmentalization at this point may not have any idea what's going on, and therefore they may be even that much more easy to manipulate.
Yeah, and there the answer to the question is who's in charge of the cover-up? Well, it's the aliens themselves.
It seems to be more than likely, yeah.
Yeah, it's just going back to and what you made me think it was when you were talking about the nature of the bureaucratic leadership of the U.S. military. You talked about that sort of corruption that was going on in the Army and the Marine Corps, but I wonder is there sort of are there marked institutional differences between something like the Army and the Marine Corps, which, as far as I know, are largely killing people up close and personal, or at least that's an element of what they do, versus say the Navy, which does not have that function largely, and which you would expect the command in any part of the U.S. Navy or the Air Force requires like a very good deal of technical skill and ability. Whereas maybe in the Army, the Marine Corps, where there's not that demand for technical knowledge, it's more liable to providing promotion to consummate bullshit artists, the bedeviled institutions the world over. That's then the case, and you think the Air Force and the Navy, maybe just at their higher reaches, actually do have large numbers of technically quite competent people, whatever one would say for their morality. There is at least with that, a bit like in the Soviet Union, that they found that large numbers of dissidents came from the hard sciences, who were people with technical and technological backgrounds, because they themselves were used to analyzing what is rather than what they're meant to see. I'd wonder, is that there? As for Greer's, suppositions and his self-aggrandisement, I take the point. It's definitely something obvious listening to him, how he talks himself up. He's that sort of way of speaking, which he is part of that world when clearly he isn't. But his claims for a sort of these Opus Dei Catholic extremists and elements of the Mormon Church having a large hand in this, I have to say, I did for quite a time find it incredible, up until my reading of a story some years ago, which found that large numbers of the U.S. Army command in Iraq, I think it was under General McChrystal at this time, were, for want of a better word, were militant Catholics who were found passing among each other Crusader coins and Crusader emblems. It was this weird little like a neo-Templar affection going on there. So, which is to say about Greer's claims for these groups, and maybe there's more to it than one would say. But as to, you can leave that aside, whatever the composition of the leadership, I think you're right to point to a very real amount of fragmentation going on.